It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
G'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode 80, and we've got a very large show full of politics around the world for you. Much going on there, lots of elections, and joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate. How are you?
Good, hot and sweaty.
Hot and sweaty in Hong Kong today. Now, you got a bit of a rant here about television. You're not happy about television, Jack?
No, I picked this up on the social media. Someone was pointing out the difference between, there's a lot of differences between TV experience today and when we were kids. But one of the big differences is that we used to have reruns all the time, so that the current generation of teenagers actually knew the kind of cultural background of their parents because they watched the shows their parents used to watch. That's not quite true in my case because my parents didn't have a television before we were around.
When did you get your? How old were you when the telly first arrived in the household?
5, 6, something, 7. You know, I mean, something like that.
I certainly remember our first colour television. We were pretty slow out of the blocks for that one, but I think the black and white might have predated me. Lived in all of these shows you can stream, pretty much all of these shows you can stream today. Maybe you're talking about the Honeymooners, of course. You mentioned the Honeymooners there, the Monkeys. Maybe those things are not available to stream anymore, but there's just a vast library of stuff available. And I sort of get to the view that I don't know who's watching free-to-air television these days. I don't think anyone. I mean, you know, I'm sure there are, but a very small number.
Do they watch anything apart from sport and the news?
Yeah, look, my youngest daughter, she's a huge Seinfeld fan, so she didn't grow up in that Seinfeld. I mean, it was, you know, she would have some of the series would have been before she was born, but she's hooked into that Seinfeld stuff. And of course, all the kids, you know, up to basically 40 years of age are children of The Simpsons. That's the other thing that's really significant. That's been a huge cultural factor for them. Taught them humour, taught them around a sort of loving household with a crazy husband and father, but taught them humour that way. Seinfeld, another thing. Seinfeld's another show, but Friends is another thing, of course, that the kids are watching now that they wouldn't have seen the first time around. Yeah. So it's happening. It's just happening a different way.
Yeah, the loss of free-to-air television as a mainstream medium of communication, though, has had one big difference is. We were all watching one or two or three shows on a Sunday night right around Australia.
Oh, well, yeah, that's right. All that's dead. Yeah. All that is dead. I mean, there are the 60 Minutes type shows on Channel 9, a Spotlight on 7, and I suppose they have an audience. I haven't looked at their ratings, but it would be in hundreds of thousands, if not larger. Those shows sort of work now, but most people are streaming TV. So it's not just that they're getting Netflix and things like that, but they're actually streaming free-to-air as well. So they might say, well, I want to watch the news. I want to watch the news bulletin. It's actually really difficult. The commercial networks haven't got their act together there because you still have to sit around and wait for the 6 o'clock version. They don't have one you can run. But it's a completely different landscape now. completely different landscape. What it has done is probably revive a lot of the shows, maybe not going back as far as the Honeymooners, which is very early television days. Jackie Gleason, and who was his sidekick there?
Oh, that's before my time.
I just can't remember his male partner. It was all sort of, it was of its time. But Jackie Gleason was a wonderful performer, of course.
Yeah, well, I don't do any streaming, but occasionally I'll get on YouTube and find an old Cheers. I particularly love that, and Barney Miller.
You need to be brought kicking and screaming into the world of streaming, Jack, so you can just flick through the library and go, oh, I remember this, and pull it out. There's a I forget the name of the title, but there's a website where you can type in basically any television series, movie, anything you can think of, and it'll show you who's streaming it. We've probably got about 6 streaming services at the moment. There are a couple that I sort of won't go to because I look at their libraries and think, I'm never going to watch much of that. But there's also wonderful things around. The Bear on Disney, Jack, is a very, very fine show. So we're finding that probably, well, as it always was in the 50s and 60s, content is king. And so we had a period there, probably going back in the 90s, where content was deemed not to be all that important, but it is all about content. Now, the streaming services share a lot of stuff. They might have, for example, there might be 3 or 4 different streamers who offer the Seinfeld series. But it is really just all about content. There have been some adjustments because after the pandemic, during the pandemic, we had a lot of people just streaming, who probably getting into streaming for the very first time. But it's just changed. The vehicle's changed. The little set in the corner is now a huge thing sitting on the wall, and it's overall much for the better, Jack. I don't know why you're mourning. You're getting into this nostalgia that doesn't really stand up. You can get all you just have to get on the streamers, mate. Get on. I don't know what they've got in Hong Kong. They'd have a whole host of them.
Nor do I know what they've got in Hong Kong. I stick loyally to the ABC Asia TV network when I watch the television at all.
You don't watch CNN or anything like that?
Yeah, occasionally.
Okay. All right. Well, you're a news consumer, and this is what we're doing today. We're going through a lot of news. We're going to start with Australian politics first. The Senator Payman defection has led to questions about the rise of independent candidates in Western Sydney in particular that could take seats from Labor. I'm looking at this. I know that there's been quite a lot of discussion about it, but I've seen no one put their hand up yet, Jack, and say, well, I'll do it.
No. There is a group called Muslim Votes who purport to be organising something on this line, but it's
there's talk that there's going to be, and candidates have been sounded out, but I haven't heard much more than that.
And you never know whether that's 2 people who had a chat over a coffee or whether it's actually an organisation that exists.
Precisely. Yeah. It is a danger, though, for Labor. Cos Samaras went through a few things yesterday on Radio National with Frank Kelly. Blaxland, 55% of Labor's primary vote is bolstered by Muslim Australians. Watson, 40% of Labor's primary is bolstered by Muslim Australians. That's Tony Burke's seat, isn't it?
Yep.
Corwell, 40% of Labor's primary is bolstered by Muslim Australians. So I guess the question is, have Labor taken this group for granted, Jack?
Probably they have.
I think that can happen in what we might call blue ribbon seats, that you tend to take your constituents for granted. and I think there'll be people like Tony Burke, senior Labor figures in the Parliament, in the federal Parliament, with seats in Western Sydney, who would say that they haven't, that they've been very active. But of course, these tensions have arisen over Gaza. Senator Payman's defection has really just amplified that. What could Labor have done to keep Senator Payman on board? And, well, I'll start with that question first, and then we'll go into some of the other consequences, Jack.
Not much.
What could they have done?
Not much. I wouldn't expect the Labor Party to recast their approach to a foreign policy issue to placate one or two members. I mean, that's always the way it is. The Labor Party succeed when it succeeds because it addresses the views and interests of the broader Australia rather than a narrow niche, if you like.
Well, I heard from party room sources that Senator Payman had never raised these issues in caucus. Others had. Yeah, but she remained fairly quiet. Now, that's not to suggest that she's done the wrong thing. She may have, as a young senator, felt that she couldn't put her views forward, or was reluctant to do so.
Has she blown up her career?
Well, it's hard to know where it's going to go, Jack. Beyond her period as a senator now, she'll sit in the crossbenches. She will
4 years to go.
Yeah, she'll be considered as part of that pool on the crossbenches to provide Labor with votes to get legislation through. It hasn't made Labor's job any more difficult than it previously was in terms of getting its legislation through. Maybe she should have stayed within the tent. Jack, is that what you're saying? Stayed inside the tent?
Yeah, you generally think so. I mean, if you're part of a political party, you aren't going to win every issue. You look at, if you go back to the marriage equality votes, or before the marriage equality votes, this was a sort of something that came up every couple of years. And, Julia Gillard, Penny Wong, they would all say, no, marriage is between a man and a woman, because that was the party view. And they stuck with the party view. Privately, I doubt that they agreed with that. But sometimes
we can honestly say that Senator Wong would not have said
would
that,
not, yes.
And I suspect Julia Gillard was the same. And, of course, we did have a bit of a fix being put in by some of the right-wing trade unions, Jack, the shoppies in particular, that were controlling the show a bit there.
But sometimes if you want to be politically effective, that means you've got to go along with decisions that you don't necessarily are not, at least not heartfelt personal decisions of your own.
Yeah, but then you've got a disconnect between the party's position and the community view, and this is the problem here at the moment. Firstly, let me say, should Muslim Australians living in Western Sydney, and that's the focus at the moment, get together a dedicated voting bloc, that would be potentially disastrous for Labor. It's not going to affect the Liberals at all. I mean, it's not as if people in Western Sydney are going to start voting Liberal. They could be voting for independent candidates. They may be socially conservative, but they would largely support Labor. So we've gone through this kind of hypothetical situation where we've looked at at Labor forming a minority government with perhaps 2 or 3 or 4 independents coming from Western Sydney.
It could,
on top of an already burgeoning crossbench.
In the UK, Labor lost 4 or 5 seats to Asian independents. It was pretty much on the same issue. But that's different. They have first past the post. With our preferential voting, it's one thing to lose the primary vote, but you can still win the election. And I don't think that those seats would necessarily be at risk. I mean, Kos Samaras quotes the Labor primary vote plummeting to just over 30% in what's really Cornwall, in Meadow Heights, in the state election, in the last state election. But they still won the seat.
Yeah, but ultimately it will come to a head. Look, what we have seen, we can see as a trend, is that it started really probably around 75, where the two major parties were soaking up 90% of the primary votes. Now it's 70, and it doesn't necessarily go down every election, every state and federal election, but it's now veering into the 60s. If we look at News Poll at the moment with the coalition vote and Labor vote, you're flat out on primary votes for both parties. You're flat out getting to 70 on that as it stands. And we always keep looking for the big independent groups or the small for independents strategically placed in electorates. We've seen the rise of the Teal movement. We've got minor parties and so forth. The problem has been for the coalition that of those parties of the right, they don't preference back to the Liberals at the sort of same rate that perhaps that the Greens do with Labor, and that's basically kept Labor fairly strong, and grips the Liberal Party with an identity crisis. And let's look at them, Jack. Are they seriously going to enter into Western Sydney? Are they going to go out to outer suburban Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and try and win seats there? They don't have the infrastructure there. I just don't understand their tactics at the moment.
Well, I think they're close enough to be where they. Well, I think they're pretty much where they need to be, and they're close enough to win. Perhaps not this election, but the one after. So I think their strategy's okay, to be quite honest. I think Labor's is fine as well. I don't. A lot's being made of this, but I don't really think that Labor's going to lose 4 out of Western Sydney seats and a couple in Melbourne. I just don't think it'll happen.
I look at the real tussle with the Greens. Labor and the Greens are at each other's throats, and they have been before. But I wonder this time with the electoral consequences of Gaza, that the Greens won't preference Labor to the same extent, Jack, and that might be a bit of a problem for Labor, and they might go into minority government as a result. I mean, we talk about Kos Samaras. Kos said there's a 50% chance of a Labor majority government being elected next year or at the next election, and a 50% chance of them forming minority government. There are no other options.
Yeah, I don't think the Liberals can win. Well, I think that's very unlikely that they would. But it's
mathematically, no, as they say, it's a possibility. But what we are seeing, and we're seeing it not just in Australia but around the world, is that a lot of the major parties are on the nose, and that comes with a lot of consequences. And the likelihood, and of course, I think in Europe now there's only one government that's not in coalition. I think it's Malta. And I haven't looked at the Maltese elections or Maltese parliaments for a little while, so that may not be the case. But coalitions of convenience everywhere in Europe, and we've avoided a lot of that so far. But I think that the days are numbered where we can actually have a lot of majority governments. I suspect we're in for more minority governments than majority governments going forward.
Possible.
Into the future. What about ethnic voting groups, Jack? We're talking about that. We're dancing around it a bit there. Anthony Albanese came out and said that this is not a good thing for Australia. It's just normal politics, though, isn't it, Jack? People people coming together under shared circumstances.
It is. The Labor Party in Australia was, 40% Irish Catholic at one stage. And that's what I grew up in, and it was considered completely normal. And I don't know what Albo's on about, but yet the last thing you can do is try and regulate this to make it better. You've just got to deal with it.
Yeah, you just have to deal with it. And you should be very guarded about what you say about it too. I think that's the other thing, because I thought Albanese's remarks were pretty odd last week, and I just would have thought, well, he said, look, his response to it should have been, look, I've been living in Western Sydney most of my life, or in the inner west of Sydney. I know it's a vibrant, multicultural place, and we would expect various groups to rise into political organisations as we go. It's just that you would see it almost as organic.
Indeed. I mean, in my youthful days in the ALP, we had a huge Greek population in the inner north of Melbourne. And there were various attempts to get them to vote as a bloc. They never really quite worked because they were more diverse, that the Greeks were a more diverse group than the people trying to put this together thought they were. It might be different with the Muslims in Western Sydney, but I kind of doubt it.
And of course, at some point, regardless of the nature of the ethnic group, they're going to say, well, we're not just going to be a voting pool for you. We want representation.
Yes.
And look, that is certainly starting to happen through the Labor Party, I'd say. But it's a long and slow process. And I guess for Fatima Payman, she would be an example of that she was picked to be the third senator in Western Australia. They weren't expecting her to win, but Labor's vote in Western Australia ballooned in the last election, so they got 3 senators up.
So she was a bit lucky to be there. Probably wouldn't win a second run anyway. And let's face it, 4 years being on the backbench in the Senate's nice light work.
Yeah, I wouldn't be telling her what to do. She's going to act with her conscience, and that's perfectly fine. But what she sort of put herself into the position of is that she'll just now be just another member of the crossbench, another person that Labor will deal with, and it will make a headline every now and then, but it'll be pretty quiet. Be pretty quiet around that. Should Labor have allowed a conscience vote, Jack?
Probably not. This to me is not a matter of conscience. It's a political, purely political decision.
Yeah. Okay. Oh well. I did note last week that there might have been some backgrounding going on. I don't know for sure, but there was some suggestions that Senator Payman might have some Section 44 issues. She was, of course, born in Afghanistan. It would be extremely difficult for her to renounce her Afghan citizenship, and I believe the requirement of Section 44. What is it? Which one is it? Section 44(2)?
I think
Can't remember now. But that she has taken all necessary steps to renounce. Whether she's renounced or not is sort of irrelevant. But the fact that I think journalists were backgrounded on this tells me that they were playing pretty hard ball, and they did back off. They did back off earlier this week as we record this on the 9th of July. It was nasty stuff, and they shouldn't have gone anywhere near it.
They also told me that through the newspapers that she's bought a flat in Canberra, which she can pay for by her per diem allowance when she's there. This would put her in line with a hell of a lot of other parliamentarians, but this seemed to be an attempt to smear her. I've got to say, the High Court, as I will say forever, it cannot be wrong, but on the Section 44 thing, it was badly mistaken.
Well, that's the way it is, Jack. Barnaby Joyce was a double secret New Zealander, and that was the end of it. In fact, we were going through this. It was Scott Ludlam who was the first. Do you remember?
Yes.
And Ludlam had been Ludlam. I think he had England. I think his origins were British. I could be wrong. And Ludlam had been jumping on the burner from Perth to Canberra on a fairly regular basis, and when he got rolled, he just went, "Oh, that's it, fair enough, I'll just resign," and he did. But of course, a number of them stayed around, and Barnaby Joyce discovered that New Zealand citizenship is a very strange beast, and it's handed over to grandchildren.
And the way the High
who've
Court
never set foot in the country, potentially,
and the way the High Court put it was that even if you weren't aware that someone had made an application, say, for citizenship on your part. And say Irish grandchildren of an Irish...
Well, it wasn't even making an application because the New Zealand citizenship was just invested upon you.
Yeah. No,
whether you knew it or not.
As I say, the brothers and sisters on the High Court can't be wrong, but they can be mistaken.
They are not allowed to be wrong. Yeah, it was an interesting time. But Labor using it as a bit of a tool against her, I got the sense there was a bit of work being done there behind the scenes, and I just looked at it and went, "You guys are nuts. Just leave that alone, please."
Yeah. Firstly, it wasn't going to work, and secondly, it was terrible politics.
Just mean. And the Labor Party is not above being mean and horrible, but that was a step too far. All right. Cost of living pressure. Food prices up 17% since 2020. Where'd you get that figure from, Jack?
Mr. Samaras.
I suppose it's right. I haven't seen, 4 years. I could only concur. Being a regular supermarket shopper, I could regularly, I could sort of see it. Just things like butter used to be just under $5. Now it's sort of up to $7. And these are staples that people have to buy, 17% up. So this is where a lot of economic hardship is coming from. That's driving a lot of doubt about the two major parties, Jack.
Yeah, there are peculiar issues about butter. It's gone up worldwide, and Australia's now a net importer of butter. We used to be an exporter back when.
Is that right?
When
We're
I was
importing butter? How does that happen? I know that our dairy industry, there's no capacity for export at all there.
Yeah.
In our dairy industry, it really just caters for the domestic market, and that's it. Because certain times they say, "Oh, why can't we sell our milk and our powdered products and things like that to China?" Well, New Zealand's been doing it. At one point, around about 2015, New Zealand was providing 85% of all China's dairy imports. That's a big number. Yes. And New Zealand was awash with cash as a result. I mean, there were a number of things that occurred there that added to that. Of course, there was the Christchurch rebuild with, I think, some $26 billion injected into the economy. But significant trade relationships with China, particularly around dairy, also around timber. But moving on, Jack.
Will we get a
17%?
Will we get a rate rise in August? That's the key question, isn't it? Because it seemed to me that the government's view was that they would get a rate reduction or two later in the year, and that would set them up for a nice summer, and then go to an election in February, March 2025.
Some talk, a little bit of a whisper about the December election, Jack. Haven't heard it confirmed. But they'd be looking at the calendar.
Yeah, and
that'd be as early as they would go.
If there is a rate rise, say in August or September, does that make that too hard to do?
it would make a December one. It would wipe a December election out, I would say. Yeah, look, I'm not sure that there's great pressure. I follow, as you probably do, Stephen Koukoulas, the Kook, on Twitter, sort of progressive economist. The issue around inflation, we did have another bad month where it went up, but there were some calendarisation issues without going into the peculiarities of it, and that there was only very, very negligible growth in the CPI in real terms. I don't know that there's any real pressure on the RBA to jack up rates, and I think it would be a bad move. I mean, it'd be a horrifically bad move for the Labor government. But we do have inflation to get under control.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jack? What do you think? See, I would think Chalmers would be assuming that by around about the end of the year that he would that there would be that the RBA would ease interest rates.
Yes, I think that's what they were expecting. I think they're not quite so sure now.
They're not quite so sure. I don't think it'll happen this year. I'm just looking at the RBA's behaviour under their new chair. And it seems like they're fairly conservative about this. I mean, it's incredibly blunt weapon to use interest rate hikes on people, and it can be absolutely savage. And then there's a lot of economic theory that says it doesn't actually produce the sort of counter-inflationary measures that it's required to.
Yeah, all I know is politically, I think there are arguments about that. But politically, Labor would be wanting to go to an election with a recent rate reduction under their belt.
I think what we can say is that a rate, an easing of interest rates from the RBA seems, before the end of this year, seems less likely now than it did a month ago. And that creates some political problems for the government. Overseas now, Jack, Paul Keating once mentioned you got to get these blokes, they're erudite to their chairs. You got to get rid of them. Is someone going to go and do that to Joe Biden?
Well, the fight back is certainly on, isn't it?
Yeah, you made a point last week, and I sort of poo-pooed it a bit. I mean, you talked about Jill Biden and her being, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, her being sort of complicit with her husband.
Oh, I went further. I went further than that. I said that she was keeping him in the race because she's bolstering him completely. And I was getting pushback from people who, like you and I, have watched parents, deteriorate in this way. And these people who are, to every last one of them that I spoke to about this would be a Democrat voter if they were American. They were all saying what she was doing was unconscionable.
Yeah, I heard from one of our listeners, Rob. G'day, Rob. On the weekend, who agreed with you, and I sort of I did some thinking about
that
it.
Must have been a shock to you.
I think it was a shock to him, Jack. Anyway, he said he agreed. He agreed with you, and it's obvious to me. And when I thought about it, I thought, well, she must know. She must be aware of the physical and mental deterioration of her husband. She's a young woman, of course.
And she's a very hands-on First Lady, so she's got a role to play in it. So it's not like he goes to work and he goes back to the East Wing in the afternoon. That's the first time he sees her. It's not like that at all. She's involved. Yeah,
and I think, they've got to. So what do they do, Jack? I mean, there's reports that the money's drying up. A lot of the big donors are very concerned.
Saw a report today from one of what they call the bundlers, the people who put this together, and he said he stopped telephoning people because they won't pick up the phone.
Yeah, that's a shocker. And so we've talked about this. We've talked about Barack Obama in the white suit turning up and tapping Joe, but really it's got to come down to Biden. And at this stage, he doesn't seem like he wants to go. He was in Pennsylvania. I saw him yesterday, and looking quite sprightly. He has that weird gait, that weird shuffling gait, which doesn't look great. But he was in pretty good shape. But I
don't think the gait matters.
He was interviewed on radio in Philadelphia, and the interviewer has since resigned, Jack, because she was asking questions put to him by if she was provided a list of questions by his aides to ask him.
I don't think she's resigned. She's been sacked.
Well, resigned is a term they use in the media, but yes, it was all very sudden.
Yeah, no, I don't think the way he walks matters. FDR, no one kind of knew.
Walk at all.
Yeah, he couldn't walk at all. You know,
but no one saw that day. They only ever shot him from the waist up.
I mean, lots of people have bad
disabilities.
Disabilities.
Yeah, we're not talking about disabilities. We're talking about mental disintegration.
Yeah, that's right. It's the walking doesn't matter. It's the mental acuity that matters, and on that he's clearly floundering.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about journalists maybe being complicit in this, and even Chris Mitchell in his column on Monday in the Oz, he said that perhaps some of the Australian media are culpable as well. There's a few things I want to say. I was genuinely shocked by his performance in the debate. I was genuinely shocked at his mental capacity or mental acuity at that point. I'd read a lot of the stories about his issues there in terms of his mental acuity. And I'd seen a lot of clips and those sorts of things, but I was genuinely shocked. When you wander off in the middle of a debate, and this was 8 minutes in, when you wander off, you freeze, and then you wander off because you just completely lost who you were talking about, and you're unable to recover from that. It was a shocking thing for me. I have seen clips that are put around on social media of him where they slow it down. They slow the audio down so it makes him look even worse. So I think I was of the view that some of it was a bit overstated. So when the debate occurred, I was genuinely shocked and very quickly came to the view that he could not remain as a candidate.
Yeah, I wasn't shocked. He'd been bad, in my view, for quite some time, and the business of the White House vetting questions, that had been going on for a long time. It was caught on film with him with
that's right.
A piece of paper in his hand, a card in his hand, with the name of the interviewer and the question she was going to ask, so he could call on her and know what she's going to say. That had been going on for a long time. To me, watching the debate, he was just much worse than I thought he'd be. But he was. Yeah. It was always going to be bad.
Everyone thought that. Yeah. To the extent that there's some complicity with the media, that may well have occurred. I'm not quite sure that
I don't think there was
brought out here.
I don't think there was complicity, and I don't think whatever the Australian media does doesn't matter because there's not many American voters in Australia. I don't think they see it as complicity. The way I see it is that a lot of the media had formed a view that the re-election of Trump would be so bad that they would go along with anything pretty much to prevent that from happening. And that's when you lead to errors of judgment.
Yeah, these sorts of things did occur in 2016. 2020, I think Trump was just about done anyway, and it wouldn't have mattered. And I guess that's so there are a couple of questions here. The first one, is it okay for media to be briefed on what questions to ask a political figure? Is that okay?
Not if you're
it shouldn't happen, should it?
Not if you're
it shouldn't happen in a,
Not if you're
this is the sort of stuff that brings down perceptions of mainstream media all over the world.
Look, if he was going on a mid-morning show that's really about cooking and fashion or something, and they had a bit of a heads up with what to ask him, that's okay. But if you style yourself as any kind of serious news, current affairs, or political journalist, no, you can't do that.
Can't do that. And it speaks too of the relationship between, let's look at our own Canberra Press Gallery, who are, there's not a lot of love for them out in the boondocks, Jack. Where they're perceived to have cosy relationships with politicians. Now, there is, to some extent, relationships that they have to enter. It's a great story. I've been quoting Keating a bit, but Keating used to drag journalists into his office and say, if you look after us, we'll look after you. But if you come around and if you're critical of us, then we'll put you on the Z grade. We'll put you on the Z grade drip, and that was a term that he used. So all you'd get was basically you'd never get a question. So there is this kind of unnatural relationship between the press gallery and the government, in that the gallery needs access. So individual journalists need to have those contacts with ministers and senior figures in the government. At the same time, if they are overly critical, they'll know they'll be shut out.
Yeah, but then it can turn. This morning I watched, what's her name? Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press correspondent, the White House,
yes.
Right. And she's had a very cosy relationship with most of them, with the exception of Peter Doocy, with the whole room.
Peter Doocy she doesn't like.
Yeah, let me tell you, that turned around. It was very combative this morning.
Right. And about Biden's health?
Yep. And she was trying to fob them off as she usually does. That's her job. And it just wasn't working.
Pundit hat on, Jack. When's this going? This has to be done soon. I mean, if we go another month, and then lead into the Democratic National Convention in mid-August, and Biden's there accepting the candidacy. That's it. That's basically done, isn't it?
Yeah. I've noticed we're at the stage where senior figures in the party are saying he's got our support, Barack Obama and all that sort of stuff. And watching that, it just made me think of when the football club president says we've got full confidence in the coach.
Full confidence in the coach, and he'll be coaching next year.
Exactly.
He'll may not be here, but
and then they start waiting.
Yeah.
And then the coach starts looking through the Venetian blinds to see whether Ian Collins' car's pulling up out the front.
Now, we got a little bit of a story about that in our sports today. Coach of the West Coast Eagles, where they're sort of backgrounding against him at the moment. You can see that all going on. For mine, it's got to happen really in the next couple of weeks. And Joe needs to do the fireside chat with the American people and explain that he wants to continue to be the president, but he will not be running for the presidency in this year's election. He wants to remain as president, serve out his term, because there are some issues there, aren't there, that he could, people say, well, if you can't be the candidate for 24, maybe you shouldn't be the president at all, and that would bring Kamala into the fray.
I think you can get through that and say, just by saying, look, I'm of the view that my health is good enough for me to be president, but I would be accepting a 4-year term if I was successful, and I don't believe I could get through that term. And if he said that, the people would know that it wasn't quite true, but they would accept it.
How would Kamala, I know you're not a fan, but how would Kamala Harris go against Trump?
In the polling, she's close enough.
She is close, yeah.
Closer than I thought she'd be. She's a pretty terrible candidate in the sense that her candidate for the nomination in 2020 She didn't get to the Iowa primaries. She had to pull out before that. There was no money and no support. She's a pretty awful public speaker. But you never know.
I've seen a few of the hypothetical matchups, and most of them, including the Illinois governor, the Michigan governor, Whitmer, isn't it? Wilmer Whitmer. Whitmer. And they all measure up okay against Trump. I mean, bear in mind, we've talked about this. They're within 2 or 3 points of him. They need to be, if they're going to be serious, they need to be 5 points ahead.
That's because in electoral terms, Trump has a high floor. That is, there is a very large number of people who will vote for him no matter what happens, right? But he has a very low ceiling as well. That means that there's a lot of people who won't vote for him, whatever happens. So there's a narrow gap, within which to play. So whoever stands against him will probably be close enough, at least in the polling. But there's a problem with Harris is the swing states are sprinkled through the Sun Belt and the Midwest. And how's a California Democrat going to go there? Especially one who's a bit of an airhead.
Well, this is when we get to someone like Newsom. I mean, we don't have to go back that far, Jack. California was a red state, and Texas was blue, I think sort of Texas is changing demographically so much that it might actually go blue, depending on how things pan out between now and the 5th of November. It's got to happen soon. And would you give Biden any chance to win if he stayed on? I can't see it.
What did you say before? Mathematically, of course, he can.
Mathematically, he can.
But I think David Axelrod, the former Obama staffer, put it the other day. In 2020, at this stage, Biden was about 10 points up. Now he's about 6 points down.
David Axelrod actually received calls from senior Democrats telling me, "Can you please stop being critical of Joe?" I mean, so they're circling the wagons. I mean, I think America is crying out for a youthful, smart, intelligent candidate. And whoever and if the Dems can deliver one, like Gavin Newsom, with all of the baggage that he has as a California governor, I think they'll just switch over to him, particularly independent voters, most of whom are looking at this and going, well, we're just watching a pillow fight between two old men.
Arguing about their golf score.
Arguing about their golf score. That was a golden moment.
It was.
And fair dinkum, if Joe might have been off 6 when he was Veep, I don't know, but he wouldn't be off 6 now, mate.
No, I'd be having a large bet the other way.
Well, probably Donald will be cheating. He'll be kicking the ball along in the rough.
He'd be using the foot iron for sure, I think, Over
to the UK, Jack, massive result. Keir Starmer and Labor have had not quite a record. Gee, the Blair record looked like it might tumble there for a while, but it hasn't worked. But he's got the 400 plus seats in the 650 seat Commons, a stonking majority. There was a lot of talk about Nigel Farage and I read some bloody rubbish on Friday, Jack, talking about Farage has got a football team and he's coming to London and all this sort of stuff. Well, they only got 4 seats. There've been a bit of a rise, as you say, in independent candidates in the new parliament, but
there are only 4 of those as well. This is a bit different to 1997. In 1997, the Tory government wasn't perfect, the John Major government, but it wasn't the rabble that the current Tory government is. And there was a hunger for what Tony Blair was offering with his new Labor, as it was branded.
Cool Britannia.
Cool Britannia.
Oasis
all that
playing
sort of
in
stuff.
the background.
And he was personally popular. Keir Starmer has gone into number 10 Downing Street as the least popular opposition leader ever since that was polled. So he's the least popular, and yet he's got this huge majority. Labor's vote was less than what Jeremy Corbyn-led Labor Party got in 2017. So this hasn't been a switch. People aren't saying, "Gee, we want Labor." They're absolutely saying we don't want it. We don't want the other lot. Yeah.
The first thing we've got to do is absolutely wipe the Tories out because they have so disgracefully governed this country. I watched the.
So it was a vote against the Tories rather than a vote for.
It was,
Labor.
There's no particular embrace of Labor and Starmer. I read an interesting piece in The Guardian on Monday, and that was by Jeffrey Robertson, and Starmer was a junior. He was employed by...
This is the
human rights lawyer.
Australian lawyer with a wonderful accent for a bloke from Epping High.
No, Jeffrey Robertson, he's the human rights lawyer, London-based.
Yeah. He grew up in Sydney, and he's got an extraordinary accent for a bloke who went to Epping Boys High.
I thought he was. I didn't know he was Australian born. But anyway, he talked about Starmer's role as a junior for him. He said he was a sort of no fuss sort of guy, and I think that's probably what they need. I don't think he's in any danger of winning any charismatic politician awards around the country, but maybe they just need someone who's going to look at some of the hard realities that are facing the UK at the moment.
Did you watch his first press conference?
Yeah, it wasn't bad. Yeah,
I thought he got off to a good start. Yeah, some of his ministers, the foreign minister, he might be a problem, but he's off to a good start. The fact that he's not popular, the fact that he's not charismatic,
it's actually probably a bonus. I think it's a plus.
Provided he puts his head down, understands the reality that he's not popular and that this is not. He hasn't been swept to power in a landslide. He's fallen backwards into the office. But if it gets down to good governance, don't promise too much and deliver almost everything you promised, and pop a cabinet government, and he'll make a fist of it, and he'll be a two-term prime minister.
Meanwhile, Jack, on the other side, I looked at some of the electorates around. I thought Rishi Sunak could lose, but it's almost a suitable punishment that he remains the member, and he says he's going to hang around. There's a lot of talk that he was jumping on a burner with his wife to go to Palo Alto to live, but he says he's going to hang around. And of course, Liz Truss, the PM for 49 days, Jack, she had a margin similar to Rishi Sunak's. And she got rolled. I think it was a turnaround about 26,000 votes.
Yeah.
Very uncomfortable moment there. Jacob Rees-Mogg, gone. I don't think there are too many lamentations around the country for the end of his political career.
Personally, I was sorry to see Rees-Mogg go because he was endlessly entertaining, but.
I think, I think government's losses, merchant banking's gain. Jack, I did see a really ugly moment during the campaign where he was basically confronted by a person in his own constituency who had cerebral palsy, and he was a very angry man, and Rees-Mogg was. It was actually painful to watch. He ended up apologising to the fellow. There'd been, a number of local issues that Rees-Mogg had not attended to, and I don't know. Sneering at people just doesn't seem to be a good political asset, Jack.
It never is. The biggest losers even more than the Tories, were the Scottish National Party.
Yeah, they've been reduced to a rump, Jack. I think they got 5 or 6 seats in the new Commons, and I think while Reform and Farage had a great impact on the election, of course they've only got 4 seats.
Yeah, the SNP went from 48 to 4, and that's probably killed off Scottish independence for a generation. People are saying, Farage only won 4 seats, but he managed to knock the Tory party out of government. Let's not underestimate that.
So what happens now to the Conservative Party? I think it's 1825, Jack, so near enough to 200 years old. You throw it in the bin and start again, or what happens there?
Well, there's 2 ways of looking at it. You can say it's easier to start with, to make something out of fresh cloth, or you can say, well, it's always cheaper and easier to rebrand what you've got, sort of like what Blair did with New Labour.
Yes, I did enjoy this tweet. I'm going back a little while when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, but this is from a Conservative who was Chief of Staff to Theresa May, who tweeted at Truss, "You were brought down because in a matter of weeks you lost the confidence of the financial markets, the electorate and your own MPs. During a profound cost of living crisis, you thought it was a priority to cut tax for the richest people in the country." Jack, how is Liz Truss's loss going to affect book sales? She reckons you've seen the book, 10 Years to Save the West. Was it 12 now? We're stretching it out a bit now because she won't be in the public domain.
Someone popped up an interview with Tony Blair done just after the 2019 election, and he was asked, could Labor win the next election? And he said, well, the way they're going now, no, they couldn't. And you remember Labor was a rabble in 2019.
Corbynite rabble.
Yeah, a Corbynite rabble. And he said, we've got to get the right people in the right positions and adopt policies that the vast majority of people would generally agree with. But if we do that, yes, we can win. He's a very shrewd politician, was Tony Blair, for all his faults. And that's sort of where the Tories are. I don't think they can win the next election, but they can put themselves back in a competitive position just by sorting out what they really stand for and putting decent people in there who can push the policies.
Fair call, though. But will you be seeing 10 Years to Save the West by Liz Truss in the bargain bin soon, Jack? I just took a look at it. It's $60. $60 now.
That's very expensive compost, I think.
I don't think I'll buy it. I might pick it up when it hits 5, but I'm not buying it at 60. All right, France.
She's never had anything interesting to say. I don't want to read.
No, well, she started running around being this anti-globalisation person, sort of tinkering almost with the sort of cooker politics. It was bizarre. Anyway, in France, Jack, it is the country that continues to surprise us. We thought we were heading headlong into a Le Pen dominated French Parliament legislature, but a lot of strategic voting and a lot of strategic candidacy has meant that the far right will have the numbers. 200 left-wing and centrist candidates withdrew from the second round in a bid to avoid splitting the vote. The NFP, a cluster of several parties, so we're sort of a loose coalition of the left, has won 182 seats in the National Assembly, making it the largest group in the 577-seat parliament. Le Pen's National Rally, RN, they haven't done too badly. They'll have 143 seats, Jack. But where's the future in any of this?
Jean-Luc Mélenchon wants to be Prime Minister, he says, and his immediate aims are to cut the...
He's socialist boy, isn't he?
Yeah, cut the retirement age from, I think it's 64 now to 60. raise the minimum wage, tax everything that moves. The markets are already spooked about this. And I saw
60 was it because they gave him another. I think it was went 65 to 66, didn't it? So
I think it's 64.
That was Macron sort of dismissively issued all of that, and there were riots on the streets. Paris burnt, a number of other cities in France burnt under riots. So you think Mélenchon wants to take it back to 60?
60, yes. This is in a country with a life expectancy of 82 or 83. I don't think that's doable.
That sounds good. That sounds good to me. Sounds good to me. Look, the problem from a political science point of view is when the centre disappears or when the centre ceases to have any significant influence in your politics, bad things tend to happen. I mean, this is, I don't want to, overreact, but this is what happened in Weimar Germany, that the centre basically collapsed and it legitimised the extremes on the left and right. And I see we're coming up with something very similar today. What happens with Macron now, Jack? Is he a lame duck?
I think he announced his prime minister had announced that he was going to resign, and Macron
the Olympics.
And Macron has rejected that resignation. Was the headline this morning. I haven't gone into it any further than that. It was early this morning, but he's going to have to cobble together some kind of a government to get him through for the rest of his term.
Yeah. Okay. So what happens next? When is the next French presidential election? Check. It won't be until about 26.
Yeah, 2 years to go, I think.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Moving on from that. Yes, it's not good if you're thinking about your society. If your centre has basically disappeared, and the left and right extremes are the popular parties in the go. I did read Chris Uhlmann's piece on the weekend. What did you make of it, Jack?
Just before we leave France, one thing that is interesting to me is where this leads Jews, French Jews. French has a very large Jewish population, and
well, they're talking about teaching Arabic in schools.
Yeah, and one of Mélenchon's policies is to make Arabic an official language of France. But that's separate from what you're talking about.
Yes, but there is a profound anti-Semitic.
Yes, and it's curious to me that the French Jews are upset that Mélenchon did not succeed, because they think that puts them in a much more dangerous position because of the alliance between the left in France and the Islamists.
Yes, indeed.
And because the left has become increasingly anti-Semitic.
Chris Uhlmann, just mentioned him before, wrote a column on Saturday where he started talking, where he talked about particular pressures around European politics around immigration, Jack. And those things, we've touched on them on numerous occasions.
Yes.
The issue I have with it, Jack, is that in politics you can't talk about one issue in isolation, and that there are a whole raft of things going on. And that's how people, whether they live in France or Belgium or Germany or the UK, people will be not focusing on one particular thing. They'll be looking at the whole rather than that's the criticism I've got of Chris's article. And it was a bit sort of far away from mine, far away and speculative. A little bit like the bloke from the Times who weighed in and said Nigel Farage will be turning up in the Commons with a footy team.
Yeah. Uhlmann had a good point that migration is a touch paper right across Europe. It is across America for that matter as well. But in Europe particularly so. The outlier in Europe is, in fact, Denmark. You and I have Danish ancestry, so we're told.
There's a hoisted village there. I had a look at it on Google Maps, man. There's not a lot going on there.
You think we were lucky to escape it?
Well, there's no pub, so we'd have nothing to do.
Well, that rules it out pretty much, I think. The Denmark's different because there's a bipartisan approach to immigration and the management of asylum seekers in Denmark that's quite different to the rest of Europe. They have easily the toughest rules on immigration and asylum seekers.
Entry into the country, yeah.
So
a friend of mine went there and said, I've never had so much trouble, and he's well-travelled. Been, 120-odd countries. And he said, I've never had so much trouble getting into a country than getting into Denmark.
Yeah. And if you're an asylum seeker who loses the application, you put it straight into detention. You get 7 days to leave the country.
Wow.
That's it.
Okay. So the left and right
agree on this.
they're going to have to, obviously, Starmer mentioned this in his press conference, of course. So the Rwanda thing is dead, right? They're going to. I'm sure there will be looks at sort of third party nations who might settle refugees, possibly in Africa. They're going to have to look at those sorts of things, but they are going to have to look at controlling their borders a lot more in a la that Danish style. I mean, we're not trying to be unfeeling towards genuine refugees. That's not the issue. What is going on there is a sort of flood of, is a strong sense in Europe that governments have lost control of their own borders, and that's a real big issue.
Yeah, if you lose control of your borders, you lost control of your country. That's why it's a big issue in Europe and in the United States. I read yesterday a report from southern Sweden, from Malmo, I think it was, and they have a reduction in crime in the summer in Malmo. And why is that? The police believe it's because the migrant communities, refugee and asylum seeker communities, take advantage of the good weather and go and return to their own countries for a holiday. And that reduces the amount of street crime in particular. Now, when you get to that point, you've got a problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's anecdotal. I'm not sure that I'm aware. I mean, look, we do not want to be cold towards people who, escaping places like Syria. They need to be, if they're externally displaced, they need to be looked after.
But that's a small part of them. This chap from Malmo is saying that 58% of their long-term prisoners are migrants. 90% of suspects in shootings are migrants. These figures, you can't wash over this in Northern Europe. It's a problem.
Yeah, and so they're going to have to come up with. I mean, this is the great challenge for them. I mean, and Meloni and others, the progressive governments in Spain, potentially hard right one in Italy. Where are they? Conservative in Greece.
Geert Wilders in the Netherlands is pretty much the kingmaker there now. He's not the prime minister, but he's
but they're going to have to come up with a plan.
Yeah,
and part of their plan surely must be, let's make countries like Ethiopia, countries like Sudan, we have to make them more livable. That's part of the. One of the fellows who was part of the Rwandan pilot episode in the UK, Jack. He was taken to. He was basically taken to Rwanda by the UK, flown to Rwanda, and then he claims that within 2 days of his arrival in Rwanda, in Kigali, he was driven out to the Tanzanian border, and then he began the then he began the walk again and made his way to the UK again within months. And if you've got that kind of drive in you to go into that place, then those are very, very difficult things to knock off. And we're not just talking about one person, of course. We're talking about millions. And so part of the solution must be Africa must become a more livable place.
Yeah. The Indonesians gave us the solutions. They were telling this for 25 years before we took any notice of them. You've got to take the sugar off the table.
Well, what does that mean?
That means you do pretty much what Denmark's doing, saying there's no longer the benefits attached to being an asylum seeker who turns up in Europe. Yeah,
I got some moral issues around that, but I understand that you take the sugar off the table. The sugar really is. Australia is a great place to live, and you should come here because the place you're coming from is war torn, where there's conflict, or you're being persecuted for your religious or political beliefs. That part of the answer must be that these places in Africa and in the Middle East need to be more livable. Now, that doesn't mean we have to throw billions and billions of dollars at aid, but there has to be a step towards infrastructure in Africa, political freedoms in Africa, pushing for these things. I mean, otherwise you'll never solve this. You'll just have more and more people piling up in Lampedusa, flooding across the border. If you take someone who arrives in London from Rwanda on foot and put him back to Rwanda, and then he comes back all the way back to London, there's clearly an incentive for that person to be there.
I can tell
you. So
you,
it's a double. You've got to be they've got to look at this two ways.
If you were coming from Indonesia 25 years ago, there was an incentive to come by boat rather than to do what people do now, come on the plane. And that incentive was that you could arrive without documents. And that vastly improved your prospects of success in getting a protection visa. And that's what applies in Europe too. If you can arrive without documents, you're going to be a refugee. Wherever you are, wherever you're from.
But how do you prevent that? How do you prevent that? So what you do what Denmark does. So if you arrive, your boat sank, you were rescued, you have nothing but the shirt on your back, you get pinged as well.
Yeah.
Tough stuff. All right. Japan, Jack, they've finally knocked back the floppy disks in Japan. I did not know this.
Yeah, I've always thought of Japan that, this is kind of the tech future. But no, they've had to force people to stop using floppy disks in offices and in government offices because they like doing it.
It's a great way to get a nasty virus too, Jack.
The other thing is the fax machine, and I know this from friends in the financial services business, the fax machine is still ubiquitous in Japan. I can't remember the last time I saw one in an Aussie office, but...
Yeah, anything that requires... I mean, digital signature. Have you ever provided a digital signature, Jack, in documents? Of course, you must have done that. Those sorts of things have sort of killed the fax, because the only reason we still had faxes were to pop the old John Hancock on a document and fling it through.
Well, in Japan, I forget what they call it. We call it a chop here. They like everyone likes a piece of paper with a stamp on it.
Right.
The company, the chop we call it.
Company seal.
Yeah, and the Japanese like that. I can remember being in court. It must have been in, I suppose, the mid 1980s when fax machines were first becoming sort of popular in the legal profession, and the judge harumphing, an old chap harumphing his way through an argument about discoverable documents and saying, I cannot accept this. This is a facsimile transmission. I require an original document. And that's as recently as mid-1980s. But, of course, these days half it's done online.
Well, it used to be all that photosensitive paper too, Jack. So if you left it out in the light for for any length of time. It just went black. The old faxes, but they might have had a point there. Back to the Future, I think number 2, when that was made in the, I'm going to say mid-'80s, but I'm not quite sure. But they based all this thing, instead of sort of predicting the internet, which would have been a pretty bold move, they actually expanded on fax machines that we could actually transmit not just documents but things. They looked at the emerging technology at the time and decided that was the way it was going to go. Now, this has all been done. The Japanese, they have won the war on floppy disks. On June 28, Taro Kono, the digital minister, said he's a charismatic figure, Jack. He's got 2.5 million followers on Twitter. Formerly head of the Defence and Foreign Ministries. That'd be pretty lazy job in Japan. As well as the COVID vaccine deployment and taking up his current role in August 22 after a failed bid to become Prime Minister. I'm going to say it right now, Jack. He will be Prime Minister of Japan at some point.
Everyone gets a go up there.
Taro Kono, he will be a Prime Minister. He's got that get up and go attitude. All right, over to sport, and we'll kick it off as we always do with the AFL. Sydney have announced that they will challenge the 1-week penalty handed out for Isaac Heaney for giving his opponent a backhander. I don't think there was any intent there, but he made contact and dropped the bloke.
He was more of a fend than a backhander, but
as it stands, if he's and I have no faith in the AFL to stand with this decision, but as it stands, he would be banned from winning the Brownlow. A lot of talk about that in Melbourne about whether being suspended in the way it happens now, rather than the old days when you'd be reported by an umpire. Should necessarily bar you from winning a Brownlow, being, of course, the fairest and best player in one particular season, according to the umpires.
Well, that's because we have changed the rules. That wouldn't have qualified as a backhander back when you and I were lacing up boots. A backhander in those days was a proper whack.
Knocked him rotten.
Yeah.
Knocked him rotten. Player had to be treated for bleeding from the nose, badly broken nose. So it was had a bit of 1985 about it, Jack.
But it certainly wasn't done with the intent that it.
Maybe not the intent, but the way it all ended up.
But and I've got no problem. I'm a Sydney fan, but I've got no problem with him getting a week for that, to be quite honest.
Does this deliver the Brownlow to Patrick Cripps?
Your newspaper, The Australian, says that Nick Dacos is the red-hot favourite for that. So.
Don't know. Early season form. I don't know. Early season form wasn't great. Look, we'll see how that goes. My tip is that Isaac Heaney will be cleared to play, but it's going to be a hard one for him to justify because
they'll find a way. They'll find
a way. His opponent has got a badly broken nose for his trouble.
Yeah, they'll find a way. I just like to see a little bit of consistency. That's all. I don't really care what they decide to do. And look, football's immeasurably better from taking out the thuggery that used to be around. And I've got no problem with them changing the rules to try and achieve that. A little bit of consistency would be nice.
What's going on in the Swans? What's going on in the Swans, Jack?
Couple of losses.
Lost a couple of losses. I just think this is a competition. Carlton, of course, got beaten by the Giants in an odd game where they kicked, I think, the first 8 of the first 10 goals, Carlton, and then conceded about the next 15, and then kicked back and only lost it by a couple of goals. I just think in this competition that it is even enough. While we're looking at Sydney being well ahead of the rest, and then Carlton, only half a win above Essendon. But I think when there's a little bit of breathing room, a list will turn up or a team will turn up and just be just 1 or 2% or a fraction off their best. And in this competition, that'll be enough to get you beaten.
Well, I agree. There isn't a big gap between the best of one side and the best of another, right down to the bottom. There isn't that big a gap.
Well, there was a perception that Sydney was head and shoulders above the rest of the comp.
Yeah, look, personally, I thought they were playing really, really well, but they were, look, they were getting their job done. But it's a long way out. And
Form can be fleeting, and it's not just the guns. But it's perhaps your bottom six who, that's I thought that was the case with Carlton on the weekend. Their bottom six have been very, very good. Just sort of had a bit of a day off. Certainly at quarter time, though, 6 goals up and you beauty, everything's going well. And the Giants are a good side, I think.
The other thing is if you're in the top 2 sides, everybody, and you're I think both a couple of games clear. Everybody else starts putting the work into you. Well, we're going to have to beat one of these to get to the to win a premiership. So everyone puts the work into how do we do this? Right?
Yeah. Over in the West, Jack, Adam Simpson, been a lot of talk about him. He's got 1 year to go on his contract as the Eagles coach, Eagles premiership coach, of course, 2016, something like that. But we can already hear the rumor, the murmuring in the media, Jack. They want to cut him down. Peter Sumich, the former Eagles great and guy's been involved in the club off the field in fairly significant ways for a long time, came out and said that Simpson should just go, that any legacy he had as a coach was diminishing by the week.
I think, in fairness, Sumich might have been an unsuccessful candidate for the job when.
I wondered about that. It was a red hot go.
He was an assistant coach at the time. I think he was a candidate.
But Jack, we haven't had in the AFL haven't had it. We haven't had a coach sacking in ages. Since the off season. We haven't had one go in the middle of the year this year at all.
2018, I think they snuck home against Collingwood, wasn't it, to win the premiership?
2018, yeah. It seems, that's right, and it's not that long ago. But gee, they've had some terrible performances. They look like they turned the corner, and then have really struggled.
And when you're a power club like the West Coast, the tolerance levels get quite low.
The fact that he's owed $1 million if they do get rid of him towards or at the end of this season is not going to be a problem for them.
No, plenty of money.
And of course, the Sydney Swans assistant coach, Dean Cox, one touted for the job, Jack. I'm told, reliably informed, that Dean Cox loves Sydney and would be very reluctant to move.
And I think Sydney loves him.
He's the next one in line when Horse decides to go. And
Sydney loves him as well, I'm told as well.
Yeah, look, apparently he's very, very good with the players. Very, very good. Very highly respected, but spends a lot of time communicating with players.
Origin tomorrow?
What's that?
Origin tomorrow?
No, next week.
Next week, is it?
Yeah. So we've got the Melbourne Storm at the top of the ladder, which is kind of amazing. They never have really a bad season. Their worst season when they finished 5th. And the Sharkies have dropped off a little bit. Penrith sniffing around there. Bit of a resurgence for the Rabbitohs in recent times. They've had a few wins. And of course, a bit of cricket starting, I think tomorrow night, our time, England v the West Indies. Good luck to the West Indies. Johnny Bairstow's been dropped, Jack. And to make matters worse, a few of his teammates reckon he was stumped last year, funnily enough. Joe Root got stuck in. He's not going to like me hearing. He's going to like hearing me say this. And then said, he was stumped. And Moeen Ali went, that's out,
Yeah, I was baiting a few of my English friends on the WhatsApp saying, that's very poor form from Joe and Moeen to be abandoning their beloved teammate like that.
Well, he's not anymore, Jack. He's just been dropped from the Test squad. And not before time.
But people were saying this at the time. One of his former teammates said, "Well, he's a dozy bugger. He's always wandering around like a lost sheep."
Yeah. Look, given his family background. I think it's wonderful that he's been able to achieve as much as he has at the elite level, international level. Johnny Bairstow, he's certainly been a very good white ball cricketer. I've never really rated him all that much as a red ball cricketer, but he's made the best out of some very difficult sort of opportunities. Of course, the story is that his father, of course, was a keeper for England, and the family came home and found him having committed suicide in the garage. So Johnny didn't. I think the mother got hold of him just before he went in to sea, but pretty tough stuff for a kid to deal with, and good on him for continuing on. But I think it's kind of the end for Johnny, I would think. I've been watching a fair bit of county cricket, Jack, just clips here and there. Gee, they've got some good young players that they should be given some opportunities to. Jimmy Anderson's last test, of course, as you quite rightly pointed out last week, he'll only play the test at Lords against West Indies.
He was only offered the one test.
Oh, well, that's about right. You can't have 3 laps of honour, and they have appointed him as a mentor for the bowling unit. Great bowler. I heard Nathan Lyon refer to him as arguably the greatest fast bowler of all time because he's been playing for Lancashire as well. Wonderful career. But also after the lap of honour at Lords, England's going to have to get pretty serious about what their attack's going to be like when they come out here. Yeah, they will. They're going to have to settle that right down, and look, they're going to have to pick a couple of good young players and back them in.
I don't think they'll be bringing Ollie Robertson.
I don't think Ollie will be there.
Not after that 43 off the last over.
43. I did see him tear into a side not so long back. He can bowl, but you can't build an attack around him.
He's a very talented player, but he doesn't.
Bowls about 124 kilometres. You and I keep him out, mate. Euros, of course, England. It's coming home. It's coming home into the semis.
I love this on Twitter. It was an unhappy-looking Scotsman there, and the caption was, "A Celtic fan realising that he'd have to support a team wearing orange because the Netherlands are playing England in one semi, and it's Spain and France in the other."
Spain and France, Germany out. We thought they might do okay. They'll still think the French will win it, and I'm hoping that England get it all the way to the final and then come up short in some disaster. I was just going to say, when the Hungarians beat the Scots, Jack, there was and sent them packing. There was an Hungarian supporter holding up a big banner that said, "Skirt is for woman," which I just loved. I just thought that was my favourite moment of the Euros.
You remember 2003 we had the World Cup in Sydney? And one of the games was at the old football stadium, just 5 or 10 minutes walk from home. And we went down and watched it, and then went back to the pub that was right next door to our house. It was a Fiji-Scotland game, right? And we're in there, and the barman said to me, he says, "This is great. The battle of the big men in skirts, I call it."
Skirt is for woman. Australia, the Wallabies had a very good win against Wales, Jack.
And they had a full crowd.
Yeah. So a good thing, and we're hearing that perhaps I've always said this, besides soccer, rugby union is the Australian global football code. We just need we need to have a bit of faith in the Wallabies, Jack. That's what we need.
Oh, and we could use some administrators who could find money. Who could find their backside with both hands, And,
no. Why don't we just go with the time-honoured practice of just hiring old players as onto the ARU board and just go around and do it all over again? I can't. We'd have to take up a whole show talking about the failures of the ARU and their various state bodies. in just failing to grasp the challenges of the game in a highly competitive market. Over to golf, Jack. Sorry.
One thing I like about golf is that they are pretty tough about giving people a run. Remember Justin Rose? He's won the US Open trophy, Olympic gold medal, 11 PGA Tour wins, 11 European Tour wins, and 20 top tens in major championships. And last weekend, he played in the qualifier to play in the British Open.
There you go.
He got in. Yeah, finished second. Finished second and got in.
We do have
Olympics in a couple of weeks, and I haven't been all that familiar with it. But this young woman called Jessica Hull.
This was something else.
Yeah, she ran in an event in Paris, 1,500 metres. That's her specialty. And she pushed the winner to break the world record, and she ran 3:50, and that's the fifth fastest ever by a woman.
Fifth fastest ever time. Very good form
So
going into the Paris Games. Faith Kipyegon, I think she might be a Dane as well, Jack, Kenyan-born Dane.
Yeah.
But she's the one to beat. But, we haven't had a 1,500 metre runner loom this large before the Olympics for a very long time.
I think Michelle Baumgartner might have been the last one we thought was a chance, and she'd kind of trained off a little bit by the time of the Olympics.
It's one of the hardest gigs in sport, being a 1,500 metre runner, and God bless Jessica Hull, and we hope she goes really well in Paris. All right, that takes us out, Jack. Unless you got something really silly for us.
You've been to New York, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah, I've spent quite a bit of time there. I love the place. The New York mayor had a press conference
oh, my God.
Yesterday.
I saw it.
To show New York as this new invention. It's a wheelie bin.
Future.
Yeah, it's the future. It was a wheelie bin.
It's a wheelie bin.
Yeah, and not only did he show them the wheelie bin, someone bought him a black plastic bag with some rubbish in it.
Yeah.
And he showed the New Yorkers how you put the black plastic rubbish bin, rubbish bag inside the wheelie bin. You know,
I have questions, Jack. I mean, we do know that certain members of the Italian American family do control this business. So I don't know if they've been involved or if they've been contacted at all. And the other thing is in Melbourne, Jack. We got 4 different colours. Well, they've got 4 different colours there now. I mean, this is just old stuff. It was like saying to the New Yorkers, welcome to 1991.
Yeah, well, in our apartment block, we have the different recycling bins. And one is required to do the walk of shame with the wine bottles after a dinner party here, and walk out. Yeah. People look at you saying, "How many bottles you're putting in that?"
Clink, 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 clink. All right. Well, that takes us out for episode 80 of the Two Jacks. Just a quick reminder, if you want to get hold of us, and we encourage you to do that, ask a question. Put forward a criticism or just make a comment. You can get hold of me on at Jack the Insider on Twitter. My DMs are always open. And if you want to get hold of Hong Kong Jack, get hold of him on his Substack. Give it to me, please, Jack.
HongKongJack.substack.com.
There you are. And that takes us out for the 9th of July, 2024. And we'll be back with you next week. Cheers, guys. See ya.